I need to tell you about something that happened to me 3 years ago. Something I've never fully talked about with anyone except my therapist and my wife. Even now, as I'm sitting here trying to put this into words, my hands are shaking a little bit. But I think I need to get this out there because maybe someone else has experienced something similar, or maybe someone will believe me when the people closest to me still look at me like I'm crazy. This all happened in the fall of 2021. I was 26 years old at the time, and I was working as a freelance photographer. I specialized in urban exploration photography, which for those who don't know means I took pictures of abandoned buildings, old factories, forgotten hospitals, derelict houses. There was something beautiful about decay to me, something honest about the way nature slowly reclaimed what humans left behind. I lived in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and there's really not much to do on a Friday night except maybe hit up the local diner or drive 20 minutes to the nearest Walmart. It was early October and the leaves were just starting to turn those deep reds and oranges. The air had that crisp bite to it that made you want to wear a flannel jacket and drink hot coffee. I'd heard about this house from a guy named Derek who I'd met at a photography meetup in Pittsburgh. Derek was really into the urban exploration scene and he'd been doing it for years longer than me. He told me about this place about 40 minutes outside my town, an old Victorian house that had been abandoned since the early 90s. He said it was on a dirt road deep in the woods and that most locals avoided it. He'd been there once about 5 years back, but he said something about the place made him uncomfortable, so he only took a few shots and left. That should have been my first warning sign, but I was young and honestly kind of arrogant about the whole thing. I'd been in dozens of abandoned places by that point, and nothing had ever really spooked me. Sure, I'd heard weird noises or felt uneasy, but I always chalked it up to my imagination or wildlife or the wind. I figured Derek was just being dramatic. So on a Saturday morning in mid-October, I loaded up my camera gear into my old Honda Civic and I headed out. The drive took me deeper and deeper into the countryside. Past farms with rusted tractors sitting in overgrown fields. Past hand-painted signs advertising fresh eggs and firewood. Eventually, I turned onto this narrow dirt road that was barely wide enough for one car. The trees on either side formed this canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sunlight, even though it was only around 10 in the morning. I drove for maybe 10 minutes down this road, and I was starting to think I'd gotten the directions wrong when I saw it. The house sat about 50 yards back from the road at the end of a long driveway that was more weeds than gravel. It was a 3-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a tower on the left side. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood underneath gray and weathered. Several windows were broken and the front door hung slightly open like a mouth caught mid-scream. I pulled my car up to the edge of the property and just sat there for a minute looking at the place. There was something about it that felt wrong even from a distance. The woods around it were completely silent. No birds. No rustling of squirrels in the leaves. Nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. But I didn't drive all this way for nothing, so I grabbed my camera bag and my flashlight and I got out of the car. The temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees the moment I stepped onto the property. I told myself it was just because I was in the shade of the trees, but even now I don't believe that. The walk up to the house felt longer than it should have. With each step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was like that sensation you get when you know someone is watching you but you can't see them. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, but there was never anyone there. The porch steps creaked under my weight, and a couple of them felt soft like the wood was rotting through. I made a mental note to be careful. The last thing I needed was to fall through the floor and break my leg out here with no cell service. Yeah, I'd already checked my phone and I had 0 bars. I pushed the front door open wider and it groaned on rusty hinges. The smell hit me immediately. That distinctive odor of mold and decay and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something almost sweet and sickly. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and stepped inside. The interior was dark despite it being morning. The windows were so dirty and covered in grime that they barely let any light through. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it around the entryway. There was a grand staircase directly ahead of me that curved up to the second floor. To my left was what looked like a living room, and to my right was a dining room with a long table still covered in a rotted tablecloth. I started taking pictures. That's what I was there for after all. I documented the peeling wallpaper with its faded floral pattern. The chandelier hanging crooked from the ceiling covered in cobwebs. The fireplace in the living room with old newspapers still visible in the grate dated from 1987. As I moved through the first floor, I started to notice some strange things. There were children's toys scattered around. A doll with no eyes sitting in the corner of the dining room. Wooden blocks spelling out incomplete words in what must have been a playroom. A tricycle on its side in the hallway. But here's the thing that bothered me. These toys didn't look like they were from the 80s or 90s. They looked older. Much older. Like they were from the 50s or 60s. I tried to piece together the story of the house. Maybe the family who lived here in the 90s had kept toys from when they were children. That would make sense, right? But something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's where things started to get really weird. On the kitchen table, there were place settings. For plates. For sets of silverware. For glasses. And here's the part that made my skin crawl. The plates still had food on them. Or what had been food. Now it was just black and moldy shapes, but you could tell that someone had set out a meal. But the thing is, if the house had been abandoned since the 90s, that food should have been completely decomposed by now. It should have been dust. But these shapes were still somewhat intact, like they'd only been sitting there for a few months, maybe a year at most. I took pictures, but I started to feel really uneasy. That silence from outside seemed even heavier in here. Even my footsteps sounded muffled, like the house was absorbing the sound. I decided to head upstairs. The staircase creaked with every step, and I had to test each board before putting my full weight on it. About halfway up, I heard something. A sound from the second floor. It was faint, but it sounded like footsteps. Like someone walking slowly across a wooden floor. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called out, asking if anyone was there. My voice sounded small and weak in that space. No response. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses make noise. That's normal. But I'd been in a lot of old houses, and I'd never heard anything quite like that. Those had been deliberate footsteps. One after another at a walking pace. I almost turned around and left right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. But I'm stubborn, and I'd come this far, and I wanted to get shots of the upper floors. So I kept climbing. The second floor hallway stretched out in both directions. There were doors on either side, all of them closed except for one at the far end that was slightly ajar. I could see darkness beyond it. I started checking the rooms one by one. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a mirror so tarnished I could barely see my reflection. A bedroom with a bed frame but no mattress. Another bedroom with faded wallpaper covered in little blue flowers. Then I got to the room at the end of the hall. The one with the door ajar. I pushed it open slowly and shined my flashlight inside. It was a child's bedroom. There was a small bed against one wall with the covers still on it, pulled back like someone had just gotten out of bed. There were more toys. A rocking horse in the corner. Building blocks scattered on the floor. And on the wall there were drawings. Children's drawings taped up everywhere. Crude stick figures and houses and suns with crayons. But these drawings were wrong. I can't fully explain what I mean by that, but they were wrong. The stick figures had too many limbs, or their faces were just black scribbles. The houses were drawn with impossible angles. And in several of the drawings there was this figure. It was taller than the other stick figures, and it was completely black. Just a tall, dark shape with no features. And this figure appeared in almost every drawing, always standing in the background watching the other figures. I felt sick looking at them. I took a few pictures, but I wanted to get out of that room as fast as possible. As I was backing toward the door, my flashlight beam swept across the closet. The door was open just a crack, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was someone in the closet. I could see part of a face, pale white skin, and one eye staring out at me through the crack in the door. I literally gasped and stumbled backward. My flashlight fell from my hand and clattered on the floor. For a few seconds I was in complete darkness except for the dim gray light coming through the dirty window. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally grabbed it and shined it back at the closet, the door was still open the same amount. But there was nothing there. No face. No eye. Nothing but darkness and old clothes hanging on hangers. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That my mind was playing tricks on me because I was scared and the lighting was bad and I was in a creepy abandoned house. That's all it was. But even as I told myself this, I didn't believe it. I knew what I'd seen. Someone or something had been in that closet watching me. I grabbed my camera bag and I got the hell out of that room. I was moving fast now, not caring about being careful or quiet. I just wanted out. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again. Those footsteps. But this time they were coming from above me. From the third floor. The thing is, I hadn't seen any stairs leading to the third floor. I'd only seen the second floor hallway. But the house clearly had 3 stories. There had to be another staircase somewhere that I'd missed. And something was up there. Something was walking around up there. I should have run. I should have gone straight down those stairs and out the front door and gotten in my car and never looked back. But here's where I made the stupidest decision of my life. I went looking for the stairs to the third floor. I don't know why. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe I was in shock and wasn't thinking straight. Maybe some part of me needed to know what was up there. I found the staircase at the other end of the hallway behind a door I'd thought was a closet. It was narrow and steep, and the wood looked even more rotted than the main staircase. I climbed up, carefully testing each step. The stairs led up into darkness, and my flashlight beam seemed weaker up here, like the darkness was thicker somehow. The top was a single door. It was newer than the others, or at least less weathered, and it was closed. I stood there in front of that door for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow. I reached out and my hand was shaking so badly I almost couldn't turn the knob. The door opened into what must have once been an attic space, but it had been converted into a room. A studio or workshop of some kind. There was a desk in the center with papers scattered all over it. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. All black and white. All pinned up in no particular order I could discern. I stepped closer to look at the photographs and my stomach dropped. They were pictures of children. Different children in different settings, but all of them had this same quality. They looked wrong. Their expressions were vacant. Their eyes were empty. And in the background of many of the photos, barely visible, you could see that same tall dark figure from the drawings downstairs. Just a shadow standing behind the children. On the desk there was a journal. Old and leather-bound. I opened it and the pages were filled with handwriting. Tight, cramped script that covered every inch of the pages. I only read a few entries, but what I read made me feel like I was going to vomit. The journal belonged to someone who'd lived in this house. A man. He wrote about the children. About how they'd been chosen. About how the thing in the shadows had shown him what needed to be done. The entries became more and more deranged as they went on. He talked about rituals, about offerings, about opening doors that should stay closed. The last entry was dated October 17th, 1987. It just said, "It's finished. The door is open. It's in the house now. It's in all the houses. Waiting." I dropped the journal. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. And that's when I realized something that made my heart stop. It was completely silent. That heavy, oppressive silence had gotten even worse. And I couldn't hear the wind outside anymore. I couldn't hear anything. And then I heard breathing. Not my own. Someone else's. It was coming from behind me. Slow and raspy, like air being pulled through a damaged throat. I spun around and shined my flashlight at the doorway. There was nothing there. But the door which I'd left open was now closed. I didn't hear it close. It had just happened silently while I was reading. The breathing got louder. It was all around me now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. And then the temperature dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of my face. The light from my flashlight started to flicker. And in the flickering light, I saw in the corner of the room there was a shadow. But it wasn't a normal shadow. It was 3-dimensional. It had depth and substance. And it was moving. It was standing up, unfolding itself from the corner where it had been crouched. It was impossibly tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling. And even though it had no features, I could feel it looking at me. I don't remember getting to the door. I don't remember opening it or running down the stairs. The next thing I clearly remember is being in my car, speeding down that dirt road so fast I was fishtailing on the loose gravel. I was crying and gasping for air and I couldn't stop shaking. When I got home, I tried to download the pictures from my camera. But there was nothing. The memory card was completely blank. Every single photo I'd taken in that house was gone like they'd never existed. But here's the thing that really messed me up. When I looked at the last photo on my card, the one that should have been blank, there was an image. It was a picture of me standing in that attic room. But I hadn't taken a selfie. Someone or something else had taken a picture of me while I was up there. And in the background behind me you could see it. That tall dark shadow. Standing right behind me. Close enough to touch me. I've never gone back to that house. I've never done urban exploration photography again. I sold all my camera equipment and I got a normal job doing commercial photography for local businesses. I tried to find information about the house and the man who lived there, but I couldn't find anything. No records. No news stories. Nothing. It's like the place doesn't officially exist. But I still have nightmares about it. About that shadow in the corner. About that face in the closet. About those empty-eyed children in the photographs. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone I can still hear it. That slow, raspy breathing. And I wonder if what that man wrote in his journal was true. That it's in all the houses now. Waiting. I don't know what I saw in that house. I don't know if it was real or if I had some kind of psychological break. My therapist thinks it was a panic attack brought on by being in a stressful environment. My wife thinks I just spooked myself and my imagination ran wild. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw. And I know that some places are abandoned for a reason. If you're into urban exploration, please be careful. Not every abandoned building is just empty. Sometimes there's a reason people left and never came back. Sometimes there are things in those dark, empty spaces that are older than the buildings themselves. Things that wait in the shadows for people like us who are stupid enough to go looking for them. I still have that photograph. The one that appeared on my memory card. I've never shown it to anyone. I keep it locked in a box in my closet because I can't bring myself to delete it and I can't bring myself to destroy it. It's proof that what happened was real. But it's also a reminder that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. That's my story. That's what I saw in the abandoned house. And it still haunts me. Every single day. Story number 2. Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or paranormal things. I've always been skeptical. Rational. The type who needs proof before I believe anything. But what happened to me 3 years ago changed everything. And I'm telling you right now, if you live alone, especially in an apartment above the first floor, you might want to check your windows tonight. Because what I'm about to share with you is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about what's possible. This isn't clickbait. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to me. And honestly, I wish it wasn't real. I wish I could tell you this was just a story I made up for views. But every word of this is true. And after you hear what happened, you'll understand why I haven't been able to sleep properly in 3 years. So, if you're ready for this, make sure you're somewhere safe. Maybe turn on some extra lights. And whatever you do, don't watch this alone at night. Trust me on that. I need to tell you about something that happened to me 3 years ago. Something that still makes me check my windows every single night before I go to bed. I've never talked about this publicly before, but I think it's time. Maybe some of you have experienced something similar. Maybe you'll think I'm crazy. But I swear on everything I love that what I'm about to tell you is exactly how it happened. It was late October 2021. I had just moved into my first apartment in Portland, Oregon. I was 24 years old and finally living on my own after years of roommates and college dorms. The apartment was nothing fancy. It was a small one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Hawthorne district. The kind of place with creaky floors and radiators that clanked in the middle of the night. But it was mine and I loved it. The neighborhood was pretty quiet. Mostly young professionals and some older folks who'd lived there for decades. Tree-lined streets. Coffee shops on every corner. You know the type. I felt safe there. My parents had been worried about me living alone, but I kept telling them I'd be fine. The building had a secure entrance. There was a doorman during the day. What could possibly go wrong? I worked from home as a graphic designer, so I spent a lot of time in that apartment. My bedroom faced the back of the building. There was a small window that looked out onto an alley and the brick wall of the building next door. Not much of a view, but I didn't mind. I kept the curtains closed most of the time anyway. The first few weeks in the apartment were completely normal. I decorated. I set up my workspace. I got into a routine. I'd work during the day, make dinner, watch Netflix, go to bed around midnight. Pretty boring, honestly. Exactly what I wanted. Then October 23rd happened. I remember the date because it was a Saturday and I'd spent the entire day working on a big project for a client. I'd barely left my desk except to make coffee and eat some leftover Thai food. By the time I looked up, it was already dark outside. That's one thing about living in the Pacific Northwest in the fall. It gets dark so early. By 5 p.m. it feels like midnight. I finally shut my laptop around 11 p.m. My eyes were burning from staring at the screen all day. I was exhausted. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, did my usual nighttime routine. I remember feeling accomplished. The project was done. I could sleep in the next day. Everything was good. My bedroom was cold that night. The heat in the building was inconsistent and my room always seemed to be either too hot or too cold. I grabbed an extra blanket from my closet and climbed into bed. I scrolled through my phone for a bit, checked Instagram, sent a few texts to friends. Normal stuff. I plugged my phone in to charge on my nightstand and turned off the lamp. The room went completely dark except for the small amount of streetlight that came through the edges of my curtains. I could hear the radiator making its usual sounds. Car drove by outside. Someone was walking down the hallway in the apartment building. Just normal city sounds. White noise that I'd gotten used to. I fell asleep pretty quickly. I've always been a good sleeper. Once I'm out, I'm out. I don't usually wake up during the night unless something really disturbs me. I don't know exactly what time it was when I first woke up, but my room felt different. You know that feeling when you wake up in the middle of the night and something just feels off but you can't put your finger on it? That's how I felt. My heart was already beating a little faster even though I didn't know why. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. The room was still dark. Everything looked the same. But I had this overwhelming sense that something had woken me up. Some sound or movement that my sleeping brain had registered as wrong. I lay there for a minute just listening. The radiator was quiet. No cars outside. No footsteps in the hallway. Just silence. That deep kind of silence you only get in the middle of the night. I was just about to close my eyes again when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct knocks. Coming from my window. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. Every muscle tensed up. Because here's the thing. My window was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape outside it. No balcony. No tree branches. Nothing that could accidentally hit the glass. And yet I had definitely heard knocking. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe it was a bird that had flown into the window or something. Even though I knew that didn't make sense. Birds don't fly at night. And that sound had been too deliberate. Too rhythmic. I stayed frozen in my bed staring at the ceiling, not wanting to look at the window. My curtains were closed, but I could see the outline of the window frame in the darkness. I watched it like if I looked away something would happen. Maybe 30 seconds passed. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. The same 3 knocks. Same rhythm. Same intensity. Coming from the exact same spot on my window. This time I couldn't deny it. Someone or something was knocking on my 3rd floor bedroom window at what I now realized was 3 a.m. because I could see the numbers glowing on my alarm clock. I want you to understand how terrifying this was. I wasn't on the ground floor where someone could reach my window from outside. I was 3 stories up. There was no logical explanation for how anyone could be knocking on my window unless they were hanging from the roof or something equally insane. My mind was racing. Should I look? Should I call the police? Should I run out of my apartment? I grabbed my phone from the nightstand with shaking hands. The screen light felt way too bright in the darkness. I pulled it under my blanket and tried to think. Part of me thought maybe I should just ignore it. Pretend I didn't hear anything. Maybe whatever it was would go away. But another part of me knew I needed to know what was out there. I couldn't just hide under my covers like a child. I opened my phone and turned on the flashlight app. The beam of light cut through the darkness of my room. I took a deep breath and slowly sat up in bed. My blankets fell away and the cold air hit me. I was sweating despite the temperature. I pointed the flashlight at my window. The curtains were still closed. They were just cheap white curtains from Target. Nothing fancy. And they were completely still. No movement. No shadows. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at those curtains. Waiting for another knock. Waiting for them to move. Waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. Maybe I had imagined it after all. Maybe it was just a weird dream or the building settling or something totally explainable. I started to feel a little bit foolish sitting there in the dark with my phone flashlight pointed at my window. I was just about to turn off the flashlight and lay back down when the knocking came again. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't 3 taps. It was continuous. Knock, 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 knock. Faster. Harder. More insistent. Like someone was desperate to get my attention. Like they knew I was awake and they wanted me to open the curtain. I actually whimpered. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. The sound that came out of me was pure fear. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The knocking continued. It seemed to get louder, more aggressive. And then it stopped. Complete silence again. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was some primal need to face the threat instead of hiding from it. Maybe I was just stupid. But I got out of bed. My legs felt like jelly as I stood up. I kept the flashlight pointed at the window as I slowly walked toward it. Each step felt like it took forever. The floorboards creaked under my feet. My breathing was so loud in my ears. I got within about 3 feet of the window and stopped. I could see the individual folds in the curtain fabric in my flashlight beam. Still no movement. Still no shadows. But I knew something was on the other side of that glass. I reached out with my left hand. My fingers touched the edge of the curtain. The fabric was cold. I wrapped my fingers around it and stood there for a moment, building up the courage to pull it back. Just look. Just open it and look and you'll see it's nothing. Maybe a tree branch you didn't notice before. Maybe a bird's nest. Maybe literally anything other than what you're imagining. I pulled the curtain aside. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. My flashlight beam hit the window and reflected back at me, making it hard to see outside. But I could make out the dark shapes of the alley below and the brick wall of the next building. And then I saw it. There was a face pressed against my window. I'm not talking about someone standing outside somehow. I'm talking about a face pressed directly against the glass from the outside. On the 3rd floor, where no one should be able to reach. It was pale. Impossibly pale. With dark eyes that seemed to reflect my flashlight beam back at me like an animal's eyes. The features were wrong somehow. Too long. Too distorted. Like someone had stretched a human face vertically. And it was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not a human smile. Something that showed too many teeth. Something that made my blood turn to ice. We stared at each other for maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds that felt like hours. And then the face tilted its head to one side in this jerky, unnatural movement and knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. Right where its forehead was pressed against the glass. I screamed. I actually screamed and jumped backward and fell onto my bed. The flashlight beam swung wildly around the room. I scrambled back against my headboard, clutching my phone like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The knocking stopped. I sat there gasping for air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I kept the flashlight pointed at the window, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the curtain again. What if that face was still there? What if it had moved closer somehow? I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe 20. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, my logical brain started working again. I needed to call someone. I needed help. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered on the 2nd ring. I tried to explain what had happened, but I'm sure I sounded insane. Someone at my window. 3rd floor. No, that's not possible. Yes, I'm sure. Please send someone. The operator was calm and professional. She said officers were on their way. She stayed on the line with me. I told her I was too afraid to leave my bedroom. She said that was fine. Just stay where I was. Help was coming. I heard the sirens maybe 10 minutes later. Then footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Knocking on my front door. Police. I ran out of my bedroom and let them in. There were 2 officers. A man and a woman. Both probably in their 30s. They had flashlights and they immediately asked me what happened. I explained everything. They looked at each other in that way cops do when they're not sure if they're dealing with something real or someone who's having a mental health crisis. But they took it seriously. They went into my bedroom and checked the window. The woman officer pulled back the curtain while the man shined his flashlight outside. I stayed in the doorway watching. My heart was still racing. The male officer opened the window and leaned out to look. Cold air rushed into the room. He was out there for a minute examining the outside of the building. Then he pulled back in and closed the window. "There's nothing out there," he said. "No ladder. No rope. No way someone could have been hanging outside your window. The brick is smooth. No handholds or ledges." "I know," I said. "That's what makes it so terrifying." The female officer asked if I'd been drinking or taking any medication. I said no. She asked if I had a history of sleep paralysis or hallucinations. I said no. I could tell they didn't believe me. I could see it in their faces. They thought I'd had a nightmare or was seeing things. They checked the rest of my apartment. Looked in the closets. Under the bed. Made sure all my windows and doors were locked. Everything was secure. No signs of a break-in. No evidence that anyone had been in my apartment. Before they left, the male officer said I should maybe talk to my doctor. Get checked out. Make sure everything was okay. The female officer gave me her card and said to call if anything else happened. They were nice about it, but I could tell they thought I was wasting their time. After they left, I sat on my couch in my living room with all the lights on. I didn't go back into my bedroom. Couldn't. I stayed up the rest of the night watching the sun slowly start to rise through my living room window. When it was finally light outside, I got up enough courage to go back into my bedroom. The curtain was still open from where the police had checked. I looked out the window in the daylight. The alley below looked completely normal. Just dumpsters and pavement and the brick wall of the next building. The side of my building was exactly as the officer had described. Smooth brick. No fire escape on this side. No ledges or balconies. Nothing a person could climb. So what had I seen? I spent the next few days trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a shadow that looked like a face. Maybe the stress of work had made me hallucinate. Maybe there was a carbon monoxide leak in my apartment making me see things. I even called my landlord and had someone come check. The detectors were working fine. No gas leaks. Nothing wrong with the apartment. But I knew what I'd seen. That face. Those eyes. That smile. And those knocks. Deliberate and insistent. Something had been at my window. I started sleeping in my living room on the couch. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom anymore. I kept the curtains in there closed and tried not to think about it. But every night around 3 a.m. I'd wake up with my heart racing. Listening for knocking. Waiting for it to happen again. It never did. 3 weeks went by. Then a month. Then 2 months. Nothing. No more knocking. No more faces at the window. Life went back to normal. I even started sleeping in my bedroom again, though I bought thick blackout curtains that completely covered the window. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Convinced myself it was stress or a nightmare I'd somehow confused with reality. But then I was at a coffee shop in my neighborhood. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was working on my laptop when I overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 women probably in their 50s. One of them was talking about something that had happened to her friend who lived a few blocks away. She said her friend had woken up in the middle of the night to knocking on her window. 2nd floor apartment. When she looked, there was this pale face pressed against the glass. She called the police, but by the time they got there it was gone. No evidence anyone had been there. I felt my blood run cold. I wanted to turn around and ask her more questions, but I was too afraid. Instead, I packed up my laptop and left. I walked home in a daze. It wasn't just me. Someone else had seen it too. The same thing. The knocking. The face at the window. The impossible position. I did some research online when I got home. I searched for stories about faces at windows in Portland. About knocking at night. About strange encounters. And I found them. Not many but enough. Posts on Reddit. Comments on local forums. People describing similar experiences. Always at night. Always the knocking. Always that pale face with the wrong features. No one had any answers. No one knew what it was. Some people thought it was a person with climbing equipment playing pranks. Others thought it was something paranormal. A few people suggested it was mass hallucination or some kind of shared urban legend that made people think they'd experienced something they hadn't. I don't know what I believe. I just know what I saw. And I know that 3 years later I still check every window in my apartment before I go to bed. I still wake up sometimes at 3 a.m. with my heart racing. I still get nervous when I hear any noise coming from outside at night. I moved out of that apartment 6 months after it happened. I'm in a different place now. Ground floor with bars on the windows. Feels safer. But I know that whatever knocked on my window that night is still out there somewhere. Maybe it's moved on to other buildings, other people, other windows. If you've experienced something like this, please let me know in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone. I need to know I'm not crazy. Because that face, those eyes, that smile, they still haunt me. And sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed in the darkness, I swear I can still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks. Calling me to the window. Wanting me to look. Wanting me to see what's on the other side of the glass. But I never will. Not again. Because some things are better left unseen. Some questions are better left unanswered. And some doors, or in this case windows, are better left closed. So that's my story. That's what happened to me on that October night in 2021. I know some of you probably think I'm making this up or that I imagined it all. And honestly, I wish you were right. I wish this was just a story. But it's not. It's my reality. And it might be happening to someone else right now. Maybe even in your city. Maybe even in your building. If the story gave you chills, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know that you want to hear more true horror stories like this one. And if you have your own experience with something knocking on your window or any unexplained encounter, please share it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories help me feel less alone in this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. I post true horror experiences every week, and trust me, the stories I have coming up are even more terrifying than this one. There's one about what I found in my basement that I can't wait to share with you all. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. It means the world to me that I can finally talk about this with people who might actually understand. Stay safe out there, everyone. Check your locks. Check your windows. And if you ever hear knocking in the middle of the night, especially at 3 a.m., maybe, just maybe, don't look. Until next time, stay safe and sleep with the lights on. Story number 3. I was standing in my pajamas on a dark street at 3 in the morning, trembling and covered in sweat. Behind me, the apartment building loomed like a tombstone against the night sky. And somewhere up there in the darkness, something was still pacing back and forth across a floor that didn't exist. That was the moment I realized I had made the worst mistake of my life. But let me back up and tell you how I got there, because what happened in that apartment broke something inside me that will never be fixed. I never believed in the paranormal. Never believed in ghosts or demons or anything that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. I was the guy who laughed at horror movies and rolled my eyes when friends told campfire stories. But that all changed one summer night in 2019. What happened to me that night shattered everything I thought I knew about reality. And even now, 4 years later, I still can't sleep with the lights off. Let me start from the beginning. It was late July and I had just graduated from college. I was 22 years old and full of that invincible feeling you get when you're young and the whole world seems to be opening up in front of you. I had landed a decent job at a marketing firm in Portland, Oregon, and I needed to find a place to live before I started in September. My budget was tight, so I was looking for something affordable. That's how I found the listing for the apartment on Hawthorne Street. The ad was perfect. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, big windows, and the rent was almost half what other places in the area were asking. I remember thinking it was too good to be true, but I figured maybe the landlord just didn't know what the market rate was. I called the number in the ad and a woman answered. Her voice was soft and kind of distant, like she was distracted by something else while talking to me. She said her name was Mrs. Chun and that she owned the building. She told me I could come see the place that same evening if I wanted. It was a Thursday and the sun was just starting to set when I pulled up to the address. The building was old. Really old. One of those brick structures from the early 1900s with narrow hallways and creaky floors. It sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, and the evening light filtered through the leaves in this golden hazy way that made everything look almost dreamlike. Mrs. Chun met me at the front door. She was probably in her 70s with gray hair pulled back in a bun and these sharp dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. She didn't smile much, but she wasn't unfriendly either. Just serious. She led me up 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3B and unlocked the door with an old brass key. The apartment was exactly as advertised. The living room had tall windows that faced the street and the hardwood floors gleamed in the fading sunlight. There was a small kitchen with vintage tile and a bedroom just big enough for a bed and a dresser. It smelled a little musty, like it had been closed up for a while, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with some fresh air and cleaning. I loved it immediately. Mrs. Chun stood in the doorway watching me as I walked around. I asked her why the rent was so low, and she hesitated for just a second before saying that the previous tenant had left suddenly, and she just wanted someone reliable to move in quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time. People break leases all the time for all kinds of reasons. I told her I'd take it, and we arranged for me to sign the lease and move in the following week. Everything seemed fine at first. I moved in on a Saturday morning in early August. It was one of those perfect summer days where the sky is impossibly blue and there's just enough breeze to keep you cool. I didn't have much furniture, so it only took a few hours to get everything inside. By evening, I was unpacked and sitting on my secondhand couch eating pizza and feeling pretty good about life. The first few nights were normal. I slept well. I got up each morning and spent my days exploring the neighborhood and getting ready for my new job. But then, on the 4th night, something changed. I woke up suddenly around 3 in the morning. You know that feeling when you're pulled out of sleep so fast that your heart is already racing before you're even fully conscious? That's what it felt like. The room was dark except for a sliver of streetlight coming through the window. I lay there for a minute trying to figure out what had woken me up. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were coming from the apartment above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor. I could hear the old floorboards creaking with each step. I remember thinking it was weird because I hadn't realized anyone lived up there. The building only had 3 floors and I was on the top floor. There shouldn't have been anyone above me. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the footsteps continued. Back and forth. Back and forth. For almost an hour. Finally, around 4 in the morning, they stopped and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went downstairs to check the mailboxes and I ran into Mrs. Chun in the lobby. I mentioned the footsteps and asked her about the tenant upstairs. She looked at me with this strange expression. Not quite confused, but not quite surprised either. "There is no upstairs," she said. "You're on the top floor. There's nothing above you but the roof." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to laugh it off. I told her I must have been hearing things, or maybe it was coming from a different apartment and the sound was just traveling strangely through the old building. She nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. She just looked at me with those sharp dark eyes and then turned and walked away. That night I lay in bed dreading 3 o'clock. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But right on schedule at 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps above me. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they weren't just pacing. It sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I don't know what I thought I was going to do, but I needed to prove to myself that this was real. I stood in the middle of my bedroom and pointed the light at the ceiling. The footsteps continued directly above me, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. I could actually see the ceiling vibrating slightly with each step. My hands were shaking. I wanted to go upstairs and check, but I was terrified. What if there really was someone up there? What if there wasn't? I didn't know which possibility scared me more. Eventually the sounds stopped around 4:30 and I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. The next day I called a friend of mine named Jason. He was the kind of guy who didn't believe in anything supernatural, and I figured if I told him what was happening, he'd either have a logical explanation or he'd come over and help me investigate. He listened to my story and then laughed and said I was probably just stressed about the new job and my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I pressed him, he agreed to come spend the night and hear it for himself. Jason showed up around 10 that evening with a sleeping bag and a six-pack of beer. We stayed up talking and watching TV until about midnight, and then we both tried to get some sleep. He crashed on the couch and I went to my bedroom. I set an alarm on my phone for 2:45 because I wanted to be awake when the footsteps started. The alarm went off and I immediately got up and went into the living room. Jason was still asleep. I shook him awake and told him to listen. At first there was nothing, just silence. I started to feel embarrassed, like maybe it really had been my imagination. But then at exactly 3 o'clock the footsteps began. Jason's eyes went wide. He sat up and stared at the ceiling. The footsteps were even louder that night. It sounded like someone wearing heavy boots walking slowly back and forth. And then we heard something else. A dragging sound like furniture being moved. And underneath that, a low rhythmic thumping sound that made my stomach turn. "What the hell is that?" Jason whispered. "I don't know," I said. "But there's not supposed to be anything up there." We sat there frozen, listening to the sounds above us. After about 20 minutes, Jason stood up and said he was going to check it out. I tried to stop him, but he was already heading for the door. I followed him into the hallway and we found the staircase that led up to the roof access. The door at the top was locked with a heavy padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. There was dust and cobwebs everywhere. Jason pulled on the padlock and it didn't budge. He looked at me and I could see the fear in his eyes now. We stood there for a minute not knowing what to do. And then the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. We waited, but they didn't start again. Finally, we went back downstairs and Jason said he was leaving. He grabbed his stuff and was out the door within 5 minutes. He didn't even say goodbye. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat on the couch with all the lights on until the sun came up. As soon as it was a reasonable hour, I called Mrs. Chun and demanded to know what was going on. She was quiet for a long time and then she sighed and said she needed to talk to me in person. She came to my apartment an hour later. She looked tired and older than I remembered. She sat down at my kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her. Then she told me the truth. The previous tenant had been a man in his 30s. He had lived in my apartment for about 6 months. One night he had apparently tried to access the roof through that locked door. Mrs. Chun didn't know why. Maybe he wanted some fresh air or maybe he was planning something worse. But the door was locked and he couldn't get through. So instead he had somehow climbed out onto the roof from one of the windows in the hallway. No one knows exactly what happened next, but sometime in the early morning hours he fell. His body was found on the sidewalk below at dawn. "That was 2 months ago," Mrs. Chun said. "Right before you moved in. I felt sick." I asked her why she hadn't told me this before. She said she didn't think it mattered. She said she didn't believe in ghosts and she thought if she told me I wouldn't rent the apartment and she really needed a tenant. She apologized, but her apology felt hollow. After she left, I sat there trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to move out immediately, but I had already paid first and last month's rent, and I didn't have enough money to just walk away and start over somewhere else. I decided I would stick it out for a little while and see if I could find another place. That night, I almost called my parents and asked if I could come stay with them for a few days. But I felt stupid. I was a grown man. I couldn't run home because of some weird noises in an old building. So I stayed. And I paid for that decision. 3 o'clock came and the footsteps started right on schedule. But this time they were different. They were faster, more frantic, and they were accompanied by other sounds. Scratching, banging, and what sounded like someone crying. A low, desperate sobbing that made my skin crawl. I pulled the blankets over my head like a child and prayed for it to stop. Around 4 in the morning, the sounds changed again. The footsteps moved to the far corner of the ceiling directly above my bedroom closet. And then I heard a loud crash like something heavy had fallen. The sobbing grew louder and more anguished. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I threw off the blankets and jumped out of bed. My whole body was shaking. The voice came again. "Help me, please." It was coming from above me from that same corner of the ceiling. I stood there paralyzed with terror. And then the voice changed. It became angry, hostile. Get out. Get out now. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my phone and my keys and I ran. I ran down those 3 flights of stairs so fast I almost fell. I burst out onto the street and stood there in my pajamas gulping in the cool night air. I got in my car and drove to a 24-hour diner and sat in a booth until sunrise. The next day, I went back to the apartment with a friend and we packed up all my stuff. I didn't care about the money I had paid. I didn't care about anything except getting out of that place. I broke the lease and Mrs. Chun didn't even try to stop me. She just took my keys and wished me luck. I never found out what really happened on that roof. I never learned why the previous tenant fell or what he was doing up there in the first place. But I know what I heard. I know those footsteps were real. I know that voice was real. And I know that whatever was in that apartment was not at peace. I found a new place to live within a week. It's more expensive and smaller, but I don't care. I sleep with a night light now. I know that sounds childish, but I don't care about that either. Because I learned something that summer. I learned that there are things in this world we can't explain. Things that exist in the spaces between logic and reason. Things that walk above us in the dark hours of the morning when the rest of the world is asleep. I never went back to Hawthorne Street. I never drove past that building again. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about it. I think about that locked door with the padlock and dust. I think about whatever is up there pacing back and forth across a floor that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if someone else is living in apartment 3B now. I wonder if they hear the footsteps. I wonder if they've heard the voice. And I hope to God they got out faster than I did. That's my story. That's what happened to me in the summer of 2019. You can believe it or not. You can tell yourself it was all in my head or that I was stressed or that old buildings just make weird noises. But I know what I experienced. And it changed me. I'm more careful now about where I live and what I dismiss as impossible. Because sometimes the impossible is real. Sometimes the things we fear in the dark are actually there. And sometimes they want us to know they're there. I still think about that man who fell from the roof. I wonder what his last moments were like. I wonder if he was trying to escape something or if he was just looking for peace. And I wonder if he found it. Or if he's still up there walking back and forth waiting for someone to help him. I'll never know the answer to those questions. But I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps. Or the voice that begged for help and then told me to leave. Those sounds are burned into my memory forever. And on nights when I can't sleep and the apartment is too quiet, I swear I can still hear them. Faint and distant but unmistakable. The sound of someone walking across a floor that doesn't exist. Looking for something they'll never find.